Good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here with us. Now, today we will speak about the book, the biography, and above all, what is, could be the meaning of this biography for the consequences for European history until now, and maybe not only European history. So we prepared some questions, and first of all, an introduction. A question is an introduction. It's the first question for Professor Schilling.
May I just add one?
Yeah.
First of all, I would say hello to you all, and I think it was a good choice to come here, because that is the only place which is really cool, and I will stay here. If everybody is leaving the room, I will stay here. It's really good. The second point I just want to add, because the editor is in this room, a fortnight or 5 weeks ago, Russian translation was edited, and who wants to buy a Russian copy, he or she can do it by the editor who is the publisher who is in this room. And there is a Slovakian one and a Polish one, and especially the Polish one I think is really important, because there is a certain kind of, it's not a question of the religious interpretation, but as you will know, Poland was really in problems with regard, or the Prussian put pressure on Poland, and Luther was always a kind of the German hero against the Catholic Polish tradition. So I think it's really, for me, it's a great thing that it was translated, especially into Polish.
Sorry for not being updated. I didn't know it. So the first question is an introduction. Who was Martin Luther before the 31 October of 1517? I mean, which kind of Catholic? A brand new book written by the distinguished Italian historian Adriano Prosperi is just concerned with Lutero cattolico. Gli anni della fede e della libertà. The title is Lutero, gli anni della fede e della libertà, translated as the year of faith and liberty. And until when could we say that Luther was Catholic, and after then no more Catholic? What did Luther want to reform in comparison with our previous projects of reforming the Church?
Yes, you see here one, as I suppose on all points, working on Luther and with Luther, one should be very keen with regard to expressions. I just want to formulate a provocative, in my eyes not at all provocative, but could be provocative for in this country. Luther was Catholic all his life long. In his old feeling, of course, he was Catholic. Who was not Catholic was a Pope. And the Church, which afterwards was called the Catholic Church. The notions and the expressions came up only during the first half of the 16th century. In the second part, they were already well known, the Catholic side and the Protestant side. Or sometimes the Protestants were called Lutherans, and Luther himself never accepted this expression. He wanted to, he did not want to build up a Lutheran church. So in his feeling, he was Catholic because he wanted to go back to the evangelical basis of Christendom. And here you became aware in the moment that Luther is not a hero alone, or not coming from heaven to bring new ideas to the world. If I am informed correctly, there is a movement Evangelismo in Italy, and that is exactly the same intention of Luther, going back to the evangelical roots of the Christendom. And if he attacked the church, he never attacked Catholicism. He attacked the Pope, the papal church, which is the wrong church in his feeling. And in looking not only on Luther, you see during the last 500 years, there was a research on the history on Protestant side and on Catholic side, and especially in Germany during the last centennials, it was always focusing on Luther. But never, and this was my intention with the biography, putting Luther in his world, not only with regard to politics, to economy, and so on and so forth, but putting him into the discussions within Christendom. And then you became aware that he, in my eyes at least, he is part of a broader reform movement. He didn't start to become a reformator. Reformator, in the German language, there is a distinction between reformator and reformer. He became a reformator only later on. He started as a reformer, as there were a lot of reformers within the church at that time. The problem in my eyes was that the Pope could always suppress this movement, whereas the movement was already on the way. But nevertheless, he was able to suppress it. Even 1517, the Lateran Concile was closed by Pope Leo X, I suppose in March or April, whereas the Council Fathers, some of them were eager to discuss on reforms, and their ideas were not so far away from Luther's ideas, which were developed only in the next years. He wasn't a reformator in October 1517. He developed only his ideas into the direction of Reformation during the years 1517 to 1520. So in my opinion, we have to deal with Luther and the Reformation as part of a general movement to reforms in the church, and only after Luther, not only Luther failed, in my eyes Luther failed, the Lutheran Church officials who are so happy to have this brilliant 500 years anniversary, they are not so happy if I tell them he failed. But actually he failed because he didn't succeed to reform the church as a whole. He started to reform the church as a whole, and he failed in that. But the church, the hierarchy, failed too, because it was not able. It wasn't even, they were not even able to understand Luther. They were not able to react in an appropriate way. And after that, then there came the clash, or the reform movement spread into two branches, the Reformation branch and the Reform branch within the church. And I think 500 years after that situation, it is most important, not as is a little bit the tendency among German Lutherans, especially not Lutherans, but the official church, EKD, and they have a vice president who is organizing everything. And here I have the feeling he wants to make an economic feast at 31st of October in telling people the theological differences are not so important. I think that's the wrong way. The right way is to become aware that it was a common interest at the beginning of the 16th century to reform the church, and that Luther was part of this movement, and that only 1520, 1521, there was a separation, and so the anniversary should be an opportunity to go back to the original meaning of reform within the church. Not the churches, but within the church. And now, was there another question in your question?
What did Luther want to reform in comparison with other previous projects or reform in the church?
First of all, he wanted to reform in the same way. I don't think we can, it gives a sense to argue Luther started with an idea as a blueprint of a new church, and telling or having the idea all the reform movement up to me were wrong. I am the hero who starts with a new and the real idea. No, he didn't have a blueprint. He started at a very concrete point with regard to the indulgent problem. And even at that point, he wasn't aware, and he didn't want to become a reformator. He wanted, even at that point, he wasn't so strongly interested to reform the church in general. He just wanted to tell the hierarchy that this kind of indulgent with regard to eternal salvation is wrong, not so much with the theory of the church, but with regard to the praxis, how it was preached in his surrounding, in the center of Germany, Saxony, southern Brandenburg, and so on. And he realized, and before this experience, before he heard about the preaching of Tetzel, he himself worked on his theological, spiritual problems without wanting to become a reformer, let alone reformator. He had a problem, a very individual problem. I wouldn't like to call it a subjective problem, individual problem, his own personal, or best would be the personal problem, his personal problem. How can I get a merciful God? How can I have the eternal salvation? And this was already 10 years ago that he started with these problems. And then we have to become aware that he went into the convent, he became a monk, and he thought, now I can find the right way. But his experience was that he didn't find it. But nevertheless, he he was not the lonely monk in a cloister. He was leading. He became a leading figure in his order. And he became a teacher, as I like to call it, a Bible professor. He was a general professor, but he was concentrated on the Bible work. And here became the breakthrough in his personal problems. He still had the personal problems. Will I have the eternal salvation? And he became aware the life in the monastery itself doesn't help me. And so happily enough, and the convent wasn't that bad, the convent allowed him or made him the reformer. When especially his Staupitz, he was a very good leader for this young, he was not that young, but this young monk, and they allowed him, or they told him, go and study the Bible and teach the Bible. And he did it. And then by studying and teaching the Bible, he found the solution for his personal problem. And then there came the indulgence problem and affair with Tetzel. And he realized, I found my way, but the way how the church preaches the indulgence is the totally wrong way, because they will send everybody into hell, because they don't give the right way how to find a merciful God. You cannot find a merciful God. You cannot find salvation by paying things, but you have to take Buße, and you have to work to read the, not so much to work by yourself to find the salvation, but to find a merciful God, and that you will find by studying the Bible. And this was the situation of Luther when he published the 95 Theses. And most of you will know, or everybody will know, there is a big discussion whether they were hammered on the church door. This is one of the myths, in my eyes, of German Lutheran interpretation. And even today, as all scholars know, this was not the way how it started. They have the hammer as a symbol of Luther. Luther hammering the 95 Theses to the door. This is 19th century interpretation, but not Luther's. You see, with Luther started the modern times. This was not his idea. We have to say, we don't know exactly how it happened. They could be hammered to the door. A new idea is that they were put on with glue, might be, but that is not important. Important is, and the only thing we can trace by sources exactly, that he sent 2 copies to the hierarchy, that is to his local bishop, Schulz in the bishopric of Brandenburg, and to Albrecht of Brandenburg, the archbishop and primas in Germany at Mainz. And actually the Reformation started in the case of putting the first domino stone in move, but not with respect that there was already the Reformation of Luther. And only the of faults on the side of Luther, and on the side of the hierarchy. Only then Luther became a rebel, and he became aware that he cannot have a reformation or reform, a general reform of the church, because the hierarchy didn't react adequately.
Thank you. And then we go on to the second question, or the first question. You gave to your biography the title Martin Luther, Rebel in an Age of Upheaval. Which kind of rebel was Luther, and which upheaval characterized that age?
Yes, first of all, we have here a disputation. That is very important. Luther wanted to have a disputation, but he never got it. So we have one, but couldn't we have a possibility that there is a reaction in the audience on our statements?
I don't know. Maybe at the end, if
anybody wants to have an opposition statement against my statements, please tell me and say so we could have a disputation, and so we can do it immediately if there is a reaction. Okay? Okay, now a time of upheaval and the question of rebel. Okay, you see, writing books, it's the same with Prosperi, the title of his books, The Catholic Luther. You have to find a good title, and mine is, of course, found in the German context. As you will know that 1983, when we had already two German countries, German states, there was a big competition between the Bundesrepublik and the DDR, and curious enough, the communists found Luther as one of their founding fathers in a certain respect. And there was a big discussion, and there were two anniversaries in the East, mainly I think in Erfurt, and in the West in Nuremberg. And the Luther, of course, could only become one of the founding fathers of the DDR if he was a revolutionary. And so he was interpreted in a way of part of the frühbürgerliche Revolution, early bourgeois revolution. So today, and especially the center of the Luther memory today, in this year, are former DDR country. And you have to, I realized that they have, of course, still in mind how Luther was commemorated in 1983, though this idea of an early modern revolution, very curiously, isn't followed any longer within scientific or scholarly discussions. But nevertheless, in the 1980s, 70s and 80s, this, not on the political level, but on the scholarly level, this competition between the interpretation Luther as a revolutionary and the interpretation in the West, Luther as a reformer or reformator, was very stimulating for Reformation history. And I myself, as I am now unfortunately a pretty old man, at that time I was in the center of the discussions, and I myself was shaped by this discussion. So I had the feeling, with regard to many people in the center countries, Länder of Lutheran territories, Sachsen-Anhalt, Sachsen, Thüringen, and so on, they have still in mind he is a revolutionary. Now, in the end, he was a so-called Fürstenknecht, slave of the princes, which, of course, is in the same way wrong as this interpretation as a as a revolutionary. So I found the expression of rebel, because he didn't, in my eyes, he did, as I just tried to explain, he didn't try to find a brand new progressive ideology, idea by which he wants to turn everything upside down. No, he started as part of the late medieval reforms movement, and then had to oppose the church, which didn't react in a proper way, which didn't, and not only the church, also the emperor, the both most important institutions of the time. They didn't give him the opportunity to explain his ideas, to bring them into discussion, let alone that the church or the emperor reflected that they could be on the wrong way. And in this moment, he had to go into opposition, and did it very quickly. I suppose already in the 1520, he wrote, "The Pope is Antichrist," and that is the most awful, offensive at that time. The Pope is Antichrist, and so we have to oppose him. But once again, he didn't want to oppose him by totally new ideas, progressive ideas. Revolution is the means to put the world upside down. No, he wanted to bring the Christendom back to the evangelical roots. And in this respect, I took the expression rebel, and in a time of upheaval, and this is more stronger in my book, which you friendly enough mentioned in the beginning, which came out this year, 1517. And 1517, in Lutheran, German self-understanding, the modern time came into being. And it came into being by the hammer blows of Luther. I have fine quotations of prominent German theologians in the beginning of the last century, and even in the 20s of last century. They said modern times started with Luther, with the hammer blows. This was the understanding of German Protestantism. And of course, I was brought up in Cologne, as a Protestant in Cologne, in Catholic Cologne. You might imagine Protestant in Rome is a little bit the same. So I always became aware there is another type of interpreting Christianity here. And it's the same with Gewissen, consciousness, the Protestant Gewissen. I always had the feeling Catholics have a Gewissen too. And Catholics were part on the way from medieval to early modern times too. And in this respect, I was very interested to look not only to the other confession, that is to Catholicism, but also to the Reformed Calvinist tradition and the tradition of Anabaptists and Hussites and Waldenser and whatever you can imagine, the whole spectrum of the Christian world in 16th century. And doing that, you very soon realize, no, they too have elements of reform, of modernizing the world, of Bible study, and of scholarly work in the Bible. In April, a famous Bible edition came into being in Spain. Of course, the Protestant understanding is Spain is awfully rotten, there cannot be any positive modern development, as was Rome, but Spain is even in the self-understanding of Protestantism even more rotten than Rome. But looking at 1517, you can find that the most modern project of working on the Bible didn't start in Wittenberg. Of course, Erasmus and Basel are important. The Protestants could accept that. Basel is not so far. But in April 1570, the Complutensische Polyglot, a Bible edition on the highest level of humanistic and philological scholarship, was finished in Alcalá in Spain. So one gets a feeling it is wrong to argue with Luther started everything. And then going all through the world, you can realize that a lot of things started at that time, curiously enough, really a lot in the year 1570, but I don't want to make a myth of the year to deconstruct the Luther myth and construct a myth of the year 1517. That's not my intention. But to realize that on different points in the world and on different subjects, the change from the medieval way of life into a way of life in direction to the early modern times and to modern times started. So it's a deconstruction of the idea that everything started with Luther. And I had a telephone call, and he wanted to have a lecture from me on Luther, a Lutheran person, and I told him the same as I did here. And then he said, okay, you might have right, but the most important thing started with Luther. So you can realize that it is part of Protestant and especially of German self-understanding that all the way of modern and development of Neuzeit, of modern times, started at the 31st October 1570 at Wittenberg. No, in my impression, that is a myth and ideology, but not historical reality. So, what was the next question? Did I answer?
The further question. Can we say that Luther was a political reformer as well as a religious reformer? Which idea of Christian policy did he promote? And how was this idea accomplished in the different lands and cities of the empire?
I don't think that he wanted to be a political reformer, but in the end he became one. A political reformer with direct consequences for social and political life. It was, of course, his counterpart, Thomas Müntzer. Now, here too, you have to realize it's not political ideology which drove his movement. It too was rooted in Bible studies, in theology, but he wanted to have a more direct reaction or pressure on the world to change the fundamental, the basic structures of political and social life. And as everybody knows, he failed in a really gorgeous situation. The peasant war is important in this respect. Luther himself didn't want to change directly the political and social life. But as a church and a state, religion and politics and cultures were so strongly interlinked at that time. Of course, in changing the basis of ecclesiastical structures and institutions, that meant immediately consequences for the social life and for the political life. And in this sense, he became, of course, also a reformer of the ways how people live together, but not in a sense of a totally new revolutionary basis, but in the way of strengthening the institutions being within, in Germany, concrete on the level of the princes of the territories, and of course he would have been happy, and he was always in favor of a strong emperor. He would have been happy if the emperor would have accepted his ideas and have a coercion on Rome for reforms, but that, as everybody knows, didn't happen because the emperor was a Habsburg prince with political duties all around the world. He couldn't find to Luther quite logically, so he had to rely on the princes. And it came, now the princes, that is important, the princes at that time were already strong in Germany. We had already this kind of territories which were very strong in a political sense and which had the same military and political and cultural power as had the emperor, nor even different. The emperor became more or less unimportant, but the territories and the princes were important already during the late Middle Ages. And in this coalition between Luther and the territorial princes, of course, the constitution of the empire was shaped in a specific direction, a strengthening of the territories, a strengthening of the princes. You can argue German federalism. German federalism was strengthened by Luther, whereas the center, the emperor, was weakened. But that is not only Luther's. Is not only Luther responsible, but also the interest of the Habsburg emperor in Spain, in America, and so on. So this is one point, and the other point is the strengthening of the authority of the princes. I don't know whether you want to go to that point in another question, but I think it is linked to your question. In the moment in Germany, Luther, of course, everybody has to make a public statement why Luther is important, why the German politics or politicians spend an awful lot of money, I suppose 60 million money for this anniversary. And they are asked, what is important? Why is Luther important? Why are you spending so lot of money? And so the one said our Finanzminister Schäuble, he said, okay, Luther find a lot of things which are important, but then he said, but Luther is the founder of the Obrigkeitsstaat. Obrigkeitsstaat is a delicate point in Germany, the authoritarian state. Das Mikrofon, wo ist das? Das hier. Okay, so besser? Okay. Ich dachte ja immer, ich hätte so eine laute Stimme, dass ich auch bis zum letzten... Oh, excuse me. I thought I am very forceful voice, but thank you very much. But now I have to think. Yes, with Luther started the Obrigkeitsstaat, the authoritarian way, and the tendency of Germans to be authoritarian and not any longer for liberty. You see, Luther and liberty, of course, another statements argue with Luther started liberty, with Luther started enlightenment, with Luther started tolerance, and so on and so forth. So the one argument is with Luther started the authoritarian state. And fortnight later, you can read a statement by our new president, Steinmeier, with Luther started democracy. So what is now, I think both are wrong, and my ceterum censeo is, and the book, the biography was written on this approach, on this framework, that Luther started in a quiet and worked and argued and thought, and his feeling too is from a different world, a quite different world to nowadays situation. So that will be, I suppose, another question. Freedom in his idea is quite different to freedom of our secular society today, and you have to explain it to the people. And the same is true with Obrigkeit. I think the English translation is authority, but Obrigkeit is still a more complex argumentation, and it's specific German notion of the early modern times. Obrigkeit in the 19th century by the Prussians was quite different to Obrigkeit in the 16th century. So I argued against Schäuble. The beginning of the Obrigkeitsstaat and the authoritarian mind in Germany started in the 19th century with the Prussians, with the Hohenzollern, who were not Lutheran but were Reformed. But that is quite another discussion we shouldn't make open today. In 16th century, Obrigkeit just meant, in German context, the new early modern state who was able to suppress the force and energy of the knights, as for instance in Germany, and bring them under a peaceful government by a strong Obrigkeit. It means the same as a generation later by Baudin, souveraineté. The souveraineté was established, and Luther helped it. And I said not to Schäuble, but in answer to his idea, and he helps you to take in taxes. So he was one of, not the founder, but he strengthened this kind of modern sovereign state, and he, with regard to the princes, he asked them to do a lot for education and for welfare. And so you could argue Luther is founder of the welfare state, and of the state of education. So you have to be really careful to understand this man and his world. Of course, the world, as Baudin, as I told you, they were thinking in the same categories. Of course, it was important but he had to take an alliance with the princes and not with the emperor, not with the German king, let alone with the Pope. In this direction, in this development, he had political, his ideas and his movement had strong political consequences, but not in a direct connection to our problems and our ideas today. In this respect, you have look very closely on the reception of Luther. In his reception of Luther during 500 years. And the modern time, in a certain respect, is more strongly shaped by the reception of Luther than by Luther's proper ideas.
Thank you. Now the further question. Which kind of relationships did Luther have with the Emperor, Charles V, on one hand, and with the Pope, Clemens VII, with regards to the unification attempts on the other hand, above all during the imperial diet at Augsburg in 1530?
Yes.
And I'm sorry, my question also because it's interesting to recall here, just because we are in Bologna, that some months before the imperial diet at Augsburg, in February 1530, Charles V had been crowned by the Pope in Bologna, in San Petronio's Basilica, that to say just here in front of us. So it's a very important relationship in this sense.
Yes, I know, and I hope I can find some answers, because I'm in the moment interested in Charles V's life. Mm-hmm. And so I visited San Petronio and was a little bit confused. Where exactly was he crowned? Could you tell me that? You see, there is a very high altar, but that is only from 1560, I suppose. Mm-hmm. So has one an idea where is the place in this big church where he was crowned, and where, or wasn't he crowned in the church?
Yeah, there was in the whole Piazza Maggiore, yeah, there was a huge representation, yeah, of all politicians, so to say, and all the religious men all over the world, so to say. And there are many some representation also here in Bologna in some very old palace, and also a series of incisions.
Yes. At the coronation itself?
Yeah, no, it was the Pope, of course.
The Pope, yes, of course. In the church?
No,
the
outside.
Church? Outside, okay.
In front.
Okay.
So as we can see, and read in many chronicles, of course, and also seeing these very beautiful build representations. Yeah.
Yes, you see, it's really a momentum in world history. For the first time since the beginning of the problem of Luther, Charles as emperor had a very delicate position between the Pope and the Germans in a certain respect, the German princes. The princes who became Protestant were very important for the emperor, because the emperor, as you will know, didn't have time enough to concentrate on German situations. He had to go, he had upheaval in Spain, he had problems with the Turks, he had problems with France. So it was important that he could rely to a certain respect on on the German princes, and at first place to Luther's prince, to Frederick of the Wise. And so he couldn't follow the ideas, Aleander, who wanted to have it's a little bit like Brexit, a strong, a hard or a weak Brexit. Here it was a question, a weak or a strong condemnation of the heretic. And in the end, he had to accept a weak condemnation of the heretic, and the Pope and his envoyé, they were disappointed. But Frederick was happy, and he could save Luther, because the Reichsacht wasn't published in Saxonian, in the territory where the heretics lived. The condemnation didn't exist, because it wasn't published, so it didn't exist for these territories. Of course, Rome and the papacy, they were angry about that, and there was a lot of discussion between the papal side and the imperial side, and there were a lot of tension. And in 1530, but Charles, of course, wanted to have, he was already elected emperor, but he wanted to be the crowned emperor. And so there were a lot of negotiations, and that finished, was well done in 1530 and the coronation. And then the emperor went once again, the first time after 9 years, 1521 at Worms, the famous Reichstag of Worms. Then he left the empire, Germany, and came only back in 1530. And of course, he now, being backed by the Pope and by the coronation, he had the idea, he has the authority to now to handle with the rebel or with the heretics and bring them back to the church. And he published a manifest. There's only is also a change within his close counselors. So there is a momentum that Charles might open his politics towards the Protestants. And Luther himself could not go to Augsburg, because he was only safe in the Saxonian territories, which included also nowadays Thuringia. And the Saxonian point, the farthest to the south was Coburg, with a big fortress, and Luther went together with his prince on his way to Augsburg up to Coburg, and he had to stay in Coburg. And in Augsburg, Melanchthon was the speaker for the Protestants, and he formulated a confession, the later so-called Augsburg Confession, with the idea, also from his side, from the Protestant side, the idea that now there is a possibility
to find, yes, a conviviality, at least a conviviality between both interpretations of Christendom, of the Bible, but it's quite clear that Charles also at that moment wasn't ready to accept several, as for instance, the very important, the priesthood of all Christians, that was totally incompatible with the priest church. And it is quite clear that there couldn't be any compromise. So in the end, as a historian has to state that an acceptance, one side to another, was not possible. And Melanchthon formulated the confession. At this, immediately, it was discussed by the papal theologians, and they formulated the so-called Refutatio. So it was quite clear there was no solution of the problems. Luther himself, he was, you asked you asked how was his relationship or his image of the emperor. He had a very high feeling to the emperor. After their meeting in 1521 in Worms, he wrote a long letter, a very personal letter to the emperor, to look whether the emperor could not find an understanding by the emperor. The emperor didn't answer. He had different problems, but also his idea of a church and Christendom were totally different to that of Luther. But even in 1530, he had high respect of Charles V, and that made it so complicated for him to accept resistance against the emperor. After the Deed of Augsburg 1530 became a catastrophe to the Protestants, and the Protestants were forced to find a political institution to protect them against. They were waiting for an attack of the emperor and of the Catholic princes. To prevent this attack, they formed the Smalkaldic League, and they wanted to have resistance against the emperor. Luther couldn't accept it, because at that time he was of the opinion that the government of God didn't go through the princes, but through the emperor. And so it was very complicated for him, and it was a lot of discussion with the jurists who had argued, no, Luther, not only the emperor is blessed by God and had the government by God, but also the princes. So in the end, 1530 didn't bring and couldn't bring a solution, and it even brought both parts further apart, and the Protestant side had to organize or to find an institution, an instrument of resistance, and that was the Schmalkaldic League. And in this respect, Luther had to, yes, to reform in a certain respect his idea of the power of the emperor and the power of the princes.
Thank you. Further question. a very difficult issue, we know. Was Luther a pursuer of the Jews? How can we deal with this issue now in 2017?
Yes, you are quite right. Actually, it is not so a complicated question, but it is, of course, a question with regard to political correctness. Not so much political correctness, but a situation, of course, after Holocaust. This is very delicate. Let me put it that way, a very delicate question. And here, in my opinion, it is the duty of a historian to explain the thinking, the teaching, and the behavior of Luther towards the Jews. For once again, early 16th century is quite different to 19th century, where the question of the position of the Jews became a quite radical, different point of view in Europe in general. And of course, it's also different to the 20th century, and especially to the Nazi regime. It is more confusing that one has to confess, the Protestants have to confess, that some Lutheran bishops took the side of the regime, the side of the Nazi interpretation. That is, to jump out of Lutheran interpretation with regard to theological, religious questions and differences between Jews and Christians into the racial one, into the racial interpretation. Trying to make understandable Luther's awful attacks against the Jews, you have first to argue, no, it was a quite different situation, and Luther's thinking was quite different to the Nazi and the racist interpretation. Of course, that is not very, yet once again delicate, because if you try to differentiate the question, some people argue, oh, he is an anti-Semite person. But happily enough, when I had a similar discussion with colleagues in Jerusalem, they told me, oh, get rid of this idea. You have and you should bring it into the original surrounding of the early 16th century. Luther first, and another thing I just wanted to argue, the Lutheran Church or the Protestant Church in Germany in general, sometimes they are attacked today. They didn't take a position against the awful mistakes and the criminal attitude of Lutheran bishops during the Nazi time. That is not wrong, and that's wrong. Already in the early 15th, the Protestant Church accepted this. What is Schuld? Responsibility. They accepted their responsibility, and they even interpreted Luther's anti-Jewish writing and preaching. So in the end, it is not that extraordinarily this discussion. It is just, of course, with regard to the 500th year, it's once in the public. To understand Luther, you have first to know that in the beginning, in the 20s, he wrote a treatise very favorable to the Jews, that the Jews are brethren of our Lord Christ. But once again, you have interpreted in Luther's ideas, not in the sense that he could accept an equal position of the Jewish truth and the Christian truth. They are brethren of Jesus Christ. And if we, or I, with my new theology, can tell them how the things are, they will accept it, the Christian truth. They are only, they didn't convert to Christianity only because of the popes who didn't put the Christian truth right and correctly. But now, as the evangelical truth is coming to light, has come to light, they will convert to Christianity. Of course, they didn't. A lot of rabbis, not a lot, several rabbis went to Wittenberg to discuss with Luther. They too had the feeling there is something new in Christianity. And so we have a chance to be accepted in a specific way within this Christianity. But that was a deep mistake, of course, because Luther wasn't able to accept a different truth to his own truth. He couldn't accept the papal truth, he couldn't accept the Islamic truth of the Turks, and of course he couldn't accept a specific truth of the Jewish religion. And he became the rabbis came to him and wanted to discuss the Old Testament with Luther. And Luther became angry because his arguments, he thought my arguments are the only true arguments. And he had to realize the Jews will not accept it. They wanted to discuss with him. And so he said, go away. And he spoke of the Jews are verstockt. Now, here I don't have the English translation. If anybody has got it, they are stupid. They don't, verstockt means, what? Stubborn. Yeah, stubborn. Yes, stubborn. It's not exactly, but stubborn is a good idea. Everything is...
Somebody...
That's it? Oh, yeah.
We can't hear.
Oh, yeah. Yes, but I can explain it. I can explain it. The truth is so simple and so evident. And everybody with a good feeling has to accept it. But they don't want it. They are stubborn. Yes, like sheep. Stubborn is especially sheep. Yes, sheep who should go into the stable, but they are so stubborn that they don't want. They went in the opposite direction. And from this moment on, there was a deep confusion between Luther and the Jews, but of course mainly by Luther. He understood, yes, as he did, he always interpreted his the political situation and the development of his time in perspective of an eternal conflict between good and bad, between white and black, between God and the agents of devil. From this moment on, he interpreted the Jews as agent of the devil, as he did with the Catholics, as he did with the Turks. And the really nasty and for us totally ununderstandable attacks on Jews are in the late 40s and during his really very last weeks. He died in Eisleben in February 46, and the day before, 2 days before he died, he preached. Actually, he preached nearly every day, and he preached, and he was already weak in the end of his preach, and he said, I have to finish because I feel weak. But in the last few sentences, he gave a kind of testament for the princes. They should kick out the Jews. That is really embarrassing how in his very 2 days later he died. And my interpretation is that it's the situation when the Smalkaldic war was about to start. He knew the emperor is looking for military force. The South German Catholic princes have already looked for armies, and they will come to the Protestant territories. And he himself felt that he is dying. And so he had to feel, what will happen in the moment I died and the forces of the devil will come to the Protestant territories. And here once again he wanted not only the devil but also the idea of purity. He wanted to have religious purity in the countries where his Reformation survived, and had to survive without him. And the emperor moving on with military forces. This was the situation, and when he went to Eisleben, where he died, he had to cross Halle, already a Protestant town, but as it was all over Germany, that part of Catholic institutions survived in Protestant cities. And here in Halle it was the same. And he preached in the same way. You have to kick out the papal agents, because they are agents of the devil, and when I die, they will once again bring the wrong teaching into the city. Must be pure of these agents. And the same was his idea with regard to the Jewish people, and the Saxony was they did already kick out the Jews in the last years of the 15th century. So Luther didn't become acquainted with real Jews, but in the territory of Mansfeld, you see that's awful German territorial history. Mansfeld, where Luther was born, there were several dukes, and some of them accepted still Jewish communities. And by traveling to Eisleben, he had to cross one of these small cities, a small town, villages where a Jewish community existed. And then he caught a cold. He had his wagon was open and he caught a cold, and he wrote to his wife, going through this village with the Jews, there came a cold wind, and that was apparently of the devil. You would say these were the Jews. You, his wife. So he went then to his to Eisleben and had the feeling, I have to become sure that after I have died, there are not any longer agents within our pure Protestant communities which can once again bring confusion into. And this is Luther's position, and he tells, that is quite clear, he tells the princes, you have to kick them out. You have to destroy the synagogues. You have to burn all their books, and so on and so forth. There's no question that it is radical anti-Jewistic, but not in the sense of Holocaust. I think that's really important to understand that, and the consequences that Lutheran pastors 500 years later, or nearly 500 years later, interpreted Luther in the wrong way is true too. But on the other hand, and I will finish with this point, on the other hand, you see, I'm an historian who is from the beginning doing comparative history. And so we have to ask, we have not only the German Lutheran situation, you have strong Lutheran, or one society which is strongly shaped by Lutheran ideas is Denmark. And in Denmark, you don't have this anti-Semitism during the 20th century. In contrary, when the German Nazis asked the Jews in Denmark to wear the famous yellow sign, a lot of Danish Lutheran people took the sign too. So I think it's more the specific German political and cultural development than the Lutheran origin of these ideas.